There's a specific moment worth examining closely. Not the moment a narcissist first meets you, not the moment things eventually fall apart, but something considerably more interesting sitting between those 2 points. The exact moment his initial assessment of you as an easy, exploitable target starts to genuinely, uncomfortably crumble. Today, we're going to trace exactly what this realization process looks like, why it happens gradually rather than all at once, and what it actually reveals about what he was originally counting on when he first decided you were worth his investment. Let's start by understanding what easy target actually means in his initial calculation, because this understanding explains everything that follows once this assessment proves wrong. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissists identify potential partners. This isn't random selection. It's a rapid, often unconscious assessment of specific signals: eagerness to please, discomfort with confrontation, generous interpretation of concerning behavior, the specific quality of vulnerability that suggests someone capable of extending endless patience and endless benefit of the doubt. When he initially assessed you and concluded easy target, he was reading real signals, likely accurate ones, at least in that specific moment, based on however you were presenting yourself during those earliest interactions. Here's what he wasn't accounting for, though, and understanding this gap explains the entire trajectory we're about to trace. Initial signals don't necessarily predict trajectory. Someone can genuinely, accurately present as easy to exploit in an early interaction while simultaneously possessing capacities for growth, for eventual clarity, for the specific kind of discernment we've traced throughout this entire series, that haven't yet activated but remain genuinely available once circumstances require them. Let's trace the specific stages of this realization, because understanding each one reveals something important about the gap between his initial assessment and eventual reality. Stage 1. The first small inconsistency between his prediction and your actual response. Remember what we discussed about how narcissistic strategy depends on testing, gradually escalating provocations designed to gauge exactly how much someone will tolerate. His initial assessment predicted a specific response pattern to these early tests. Some combination of anxious accommodation, generous excuse-making, continued investment despite growing discomfort. The first moment worth understanding in this trajectory occurs when one of these early tests produces something genuinely different than predicted. A calm boundary instead of anxious accommodation, a direct question instead of generous excuse-making, a pause instead of immediate reassurance. This first inconsistency typically doesn't register as significant to him. Remember what we've traced about how his psychology processes information gradually, rather than through sudden, complete recalibration. A single instance of unexpected resistance usually gets filed away as an anomaly, rather than genuine data requiring reassessment of his overall strategy, because his confidence in his own initial read typically remains strong enough to dismiss isolated exceptions. Stage 2. The pattern becomes difficult to dismiss as anomaly. Here's where something genuinely starts shifting, though still often below the threshold of full conscious recognition. As additional inconsistencies accumulate, more boundaries that don't dissolve under pressure, more direct questions that don't get deflected by charm, more moments where the expected anxious accommodation simply doesn't arrive. His confident initial assessment starts requiring active maintenance rather than simply persisting automatically. This maintenance typically looks like increased effort, escalated charm attempting to override what's not working through subtlety, increased testing attempting to locate whatever vulnerability his initial assessment assumed must still be present somewhere, simply requiring more sophisticated excavation than initially expected. This stage often produces something worth understanding directly: a temporary increase in his investment and attention, one that can feel, from the outside, like genuine deepening interest, when it's actually something closer to intensified effort at confirming an assessment that's beginning, uncomfortably, to require more work than initially predicted. Let's continue tracing what happens as this discrepancy between his initial assessment and your actual ongoing behavior becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss, because the stages that follow reveal something crucial about how his psychology actually processes this specific kind of prolonged, accumulating contradiction. Stage 3. Genuine confusion begins replacing confident strategy. Remember what we discussed extensively throughout this series about how heavily narcissistic operational strategy depends on pattern matching, on applying tactics that have worked reliably across previous relationships with reasonable confidence. They'll produce similar results again. Here's where something genuinely, measurably shifts. The tactics that should be working, based on everything his experience has taught him, simply aren't producing the expected results. And this failure has now occurred consistently enough that dismissing it as anomaly genuinely stops being psychologically sustainable. This stage often produces visible behavioral changes worth understanding because they reveal genuine internal disorientation rather than simply strategic recalibration. He might become noticeably more erratic in his approach, cycling rapidly between different tactics: charm, then testing, then manufactured vulnerability, then subtle criticism, searching increasingly desperately for whichever approach might finally produce the response his initial assessment predicted should be available. This erratic cycling differs meaningfully from his earlier, more confident, more patient escalation because it reflects genuine uncertainty rather than calculated strategy, genuine confusion about why none of his usual tools are producing their usual results. Here's something crucial worth understanding about this specific stage, connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about predictive competence and its collapse. This isn't simply about losing you specifically, it's the early beginning of a genuine crisis of confidence in his own fundamental understanding of how to successfully read and manage people, a crisis that becomes considerably more severe as this trajectory continues developing. Stage 4. The assessment finally, fully collapses, replaced by genuine recognition of miscalculation. Here's where something genuinely significant occurs, distinct from everything that's come before it. Remember what we traced extensively in our conversation about how a narcissist knows he's lost you forever. The specific threshold where accumulated evidence finally overrides sustained denial. With the specific trajectory we're tracing today, this threshold involves a particular recognition worth naming directly. Not simply, "I've lost access to this person," but something more fundamentally destabilizing: "I misjudged what this person actually was from the very beginning." This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth understanding why it produces considerably more severe psychological consequences than simple loss alone might produce. Remember everything we've discussed about how heavily his sense of competence depends on his ability to accurately read and predict people. Recognizing that his initial assessment was genuinely, significantly wrong doesn't just cost him access to you. It threatens something he's relied on throughout his entire adult life: confidence in his own fundamental skill at identifying and successfully managing exactly the kind of person he believed you were. Stage 5. Retroactive reinterpretation of the entire relationship's history. Here's what typically happens once this recognition genuinely settles in, connecting to something we discussed extensively in our conversation about what happens inside a narcissist's mind after the discard. He often begins, sometimes obsessively, reviewing the entire relationship's history through this new, uncomfortable lens, searching for exactly when and how his initial assessment went wrong. Was there a specific moment where the signals actually indicated something different than what he initially read? Did you change over time, or was his initial assessment simply fundamentally inaccurate from the very beginning? This retroactive reinterpretation rarely produces the honest, accurate answer, which is usually some combination of both possibilities. That you likely did possess genuine capacity for growth and clarity that hadn't yet activated during those earliest interactions, and that his initial assessment, while reading real signals accurately in that moment, failed to account for exactly this kind of capacity existing alongside whatever vulnerability he initially accurately observed. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narrative reconstruction and defensive processing. This honest, nuanced answer proves too uncomfortable to sustain, which means the retroactive reinterpretation typically resolves into one of two considerably less accurate narratives. Either minimizing the significance of what actually happened, deciding retroactively that you were never actually that significant a target in the first place, or shifting toward genuine, if unstable, respect that occasionally surfaces in unguarded moments before defensive processing typically reasserts the more comfortable, minimizing narrative instead. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this specific realization, that you weren't the easy target he initially believed, produces effects that extend considerably beyond simply losing access to you specifically. Remember what we've traced about predictive competence extending into his general confidence in navigating future relationships. This particular kind of miscalculation, discovering that his usual assessment methods failed this significantly against someone he was genuinely confident about, often produces lasting hesitation, a specific kind of caution that extends into how he approaches subsequent potential targets, sometimes causing him to avoid people who display even subtle signals resembling whatever eventually, unexpectedly proved resistant in you. This is worth understanding as a genuine, lasting consequence of your own transformation throughout this relationship, one that extends protective effects beyond your own life into potentially protecting other people he might otherwise have targeted with the same confident assessment that proved so significantly, uncomfortably wrong when applied to you specifically. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a fascinating trace of his psychological unraveling, without addressing what actually matters most. What this entire trajectory reveals about you, and how to carry that understanding forward in a way that genuinely serves your continued life. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something we've returned to throughout this entire series in many different forms, but that deserves specific emphasis here. This entire trajectory, however genuinely satisfying it might be to trace in this much detail, was never actually about defeating his strategy through some clever countermaneuver on your part. Remember everything we've discussed about how this transformation typically unfolds without deliberate intention. The boundaries that held not because you were executing a calculated plan, but because genuine internal work had already made those boundaries authentic rather than performed. If you find yourself wanting to replicate this trajectory intentionally, deliberately performing resistance specifically to produce his eventual confusion and collapse, you've misunderstood something crucial about why this process actually works when it happens authentically rather than as calculated strategy. Remember what we traced extensively in our conversation about the sentence that reveals genuine self-trust, and in our conversation about detachment being the only thing that actually works. Narcissists remain remarkably skilled at detecting performance, at sensing the difference between genuine internal conviction and strategic imitation of that conviction. This means the entire trajectory we've traced today only unfolds this completely, this genuinely, when the resistance emerges from actual internal transformation, rather than deliberate performance designed to produce his eventual crisis. This distinction matters enormously for anyone hoping to use today's conversation as a blueprint rather than as accurate description of what naturally occurs when genuine healing happens to intersect with narcissistic strategy. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about how to interpret your own history if you recognize yourself somewhere in this trajectory, whether you're currently in the middle of it or looking back at a relationship where it's already completely unfolded. This entire process reveals something worth holding on to directly. Whatever capacity allowed you to eventually resist, to hold boundaries that surprised even you, to develop clarity that his tactics genuinely couldn't successfully override, was always genuinely fully present within you, even during those earliest interactions when his initial assessment concluded, based on real signals, that you were exactly the easy target he was seeking. This matters because it dismantles a specific kind of shame many people carry about their own early vulnerability in these relationships. The belief that, if they were genuinely capable of this eventual resistance, they should have been able to access it immediately rather than requiring the painful, gradual process we've traced throughout this entire series to actually develop and activate it. Understanding this trajectory clearly reveals something different. The capacity was always there, genuinely, but capacity and activation aren't the same thing. His initial assessment wasn't wrong about the signals he observed. It was wrong about assuming those signals represented your permanent, unchangeable nature rather than simply your starting point. One specific moment in an ongoing process of development his psychology had no framework for anticipating or accounting for. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series. Whatever happened to him as a result of this trajectory, the confusion, the eventual crisis, the retroactive reinterpretation, the potentially lasting hesitation extending into future relationships, was never actually the point of your own transformation, however satisfying it might genuinely feel to understand in this much detail. Your growth from someone who initially accurately registered as an easy target into someone whose eventual resistance genuinely, permanently disrupted his confident strategy was always, fundamentally, about your own healing, your own reclaimed sense of self, your own genuine development into the person you were always capable of becoming. The disruption to his strategy, however real and however thoroughly we've traced it throughout this conversation, represents simply the natural, incidental effect of your own authentic transformation, not evidence that your transformation was somehow more valuable or more significant because of what it did to him. This distinction matters because it protects the actual meaning of your own growth from becoming secondary to its effect on someone whose confusion, however genuine, was never actually the reason your growth mattered in the first place. Here's the fourth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this conversation. If you're currently somewhere in the middle of this trajectory, watching his confident assessment gradually crumble in real time, understand that what you're witnessing confirms something genuinely important about your own development, even though that confirmation was never actually necessary for your growth to be real and valid on its own terms. And if you're looking back at a relationship where this entire trajectory has already completely unfolded, understand that whatever happened to him afterward, however his story eventually resolved, whether through genuine reckoning or simply continued avoidance, belongs entirely to his own separate journey, one that exists independently of your own continued life, regardless of how satisfying it might be to trace in careful, complete detail exactly how thoroughly his initial assessment of you proved wrong. You were never actually the easy target he initially believed, but more importantly, you were never actually required to prove this to him at all. The proof, when it eventually arrived through your own genuine, authentic growth, was simply what happened along the way to becoming exactly who you were always capable of being, entirely on your own terms, regardless of whether he ever fully understood what he was actually encountering when his confident, accurate in that moment assessment finally completely met the person you eventually, genuinely became. Regardless of whether he ever fully understood what he was actually encountering when his confident, accurate in that moment assessment finally completely met the person you eventually, genuinely became. There's something worth adding here about a specific confusion many people experience once they've traced this entire trajectory clearly. The temptation to believe that because his initial assessment turned out to be wrong, it was somehow foolish or unsophisticated to begin with. This deserves direct correction because it matters for how accurately you understand your own early vulnerability. His initial read of you wasn't necessarily inaccurate as a snapshot of that specific moment. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the genuine, real reasons empaths become targets in the first place. The eagerness to please, the generous interpretation of behavior, the discomfort with confrontation that often exists early in someone's life before painful experience eventually teaches different patterns. These qualities were likely genuinely present in you during those earliest interactions, which means his assessment in that specific moment was reading something real rather than simply imagining vulnerability that never actually existed. This distinction matters because it protects you from two equally unhelpful conclusions. The first unhelpful conclusion treats his initial assessment as evidence that something was fundamentally, permanently wrong with you, a narrative we've spent this entire series dismantling in countless different ways. The second unhelpful conclusion, less obviously wrong but still inaccurate, treats his eventual failure as evidence that his initial read was simply foolish, that any reasonably perceptive person should have immediately recognized your genuine strength from the very beginning. Neither conclusion accurately captures what actually happened. He read something real and accurate in that specific moment. You subsequently, through genuine and often painful work, developed capacities that transformed what was genuinely true at the relationship's beginning into something considerably different by its end. Both things are true simultaneously, and holding this complexity honestly serves you considerably better than reaching for either oversimplified narrative. Here's something else worth understanding about why this trajectory, once you recognize it clearly in your own history, often produces a specific kind of retrospective pride worth allowing yourself to feel fully, without guilt or minimization. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how difficult genuine transformation actually is, how much internal work, grief, rebuilt self-trust, developed discernment, it genuinely requires. The fact that his confident, experienced assessment of you eventually completely failed isn't simply an interesting psychological phenomenon to observe from a safe intellectual distance. It's direct, undeniable evidence of real transformation you actually accomplished. Transformation significant enough to disrupt strategies that had likely worked reliably against many other people throughout his life before he encountered you specifically. This achievement deserves genuine acknowledgement, separate from and considerably more important than whatever effect it eventually produced in him. You didn't simply survive the relationship. You changed enough, grew enough, developed enough genuine internal strength that someone whose entire operational strategy depended on accurately reading and managing vulnerable people got this specific assessment fundamentally wrong. This is worth sitting with directly, allowing yourself to feel whatever genuine pride or satisfaction this recognition produces, without immediately deflecting it back toward analysis of his experience or minimizing your own accomplishment in service of appearing appropriately humble about it. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from this entire conversation, one that extends beyond simply this specific relationship into every future situation where someone might initially assess you according to old patterns that no longer accurately describe who you've become. The trajectory we've traced today, initial accurate reading, gradual accumulation of contradicting evidence, eventual complete collapse of that initial assessment, isn't actually unique to narcissistic relationships specifically. It represents something more universal about how any relationship, healthy or unhealthy, has to eventually reckon with genuine growth and change in the people involved. This means the specific pattern we've examined today offers a broader lesson worth carrying forward. You are never permanently defined by how accurately someone read you during your first, earliest interactions with them. Growth is always genuinely possible, and when it happens authentically, it eventually inevitably reveals itself, regardless of how confidently or how accurately anyone initially assessed who you were before that growth had fully activated. This is ultimately the most valuable thing to carry forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. Not simply satisfaction at understanding exactly how and why his confident assessment eventually failed, though that satisfaction is genuinely earned and worth allowing yourself to feel completely. The more lasting, more valuable takeaway is this: you contain more capacity for growth, resistance, and genuine strength than any single moment, any single relationship's beginning, or any single person's initial assessment could ever fully capture or predict. Whatever patterns someone reads in you today, in this specific moment, represents simply a snapshot, not a permanent verdict, and the same capacity that eventually genuinely transformed you into someone his strategy couldn't successfully manage remains available to you indefinitely, ready to activate again in whatever future circumstance eventually requires it.